Hey friends, welcome back to Faith by Fire. I'm Halie, and today we are going to be diving into a subject that I felt inclined to talk on, and that is judgment, and how we judge others, whether it be intentional or unintentional, and just maybe some ways that we can learn that just letting go of that judgment gives us freedom. But before we get too far into things, I want to start with some scripture that really relates to this topic. And that is going to be Luke chapter 6, verse 37. And it says, "Do not judge and you will not be judged. Do not condemn and you will not be condemned. Forgive and you will be forgiven." I think that most of us don't realize how heavy judgment can actually be. And it's just a hidden weight that we can carry whenever we begin to judge, right? So, judgment to us could just be a thought, an opinion, or a reaction. But judgment, it takes up so much space in your mind and in your heart. And there's a lot of condemnation there and unforgiveness that just takes up so much space in your spirit and in your soul. And if we can take anything from that, just knowing that overall judgment, it's going to steal your joy and it's going to take away that compassion that you should really be having. And it's going to steal peace from you. And I think that, we don't intentionally, or at least I try not to intentionally judge. Like there's no intent 9 times out of 10. There's no intent, So why we judge without meaning to? I think that judgment comes from, places that we don't talk about. So like maybe hurt that you haven't healed from, or maybe some expectations that weren't met, disappointment in another person's choices, or insecurity about your own flaws. And I think that all of those things really do come from a place of judgment. So, maybe you had expectations of somebody, maybe I think a good example would be like, I know this is minor, but like your spouse. Maybe you have a certain expectation or a certain standard that you hold them to, and they didn't meet that for you. And I think that in that you begin to judge, and from that stems other issues that can fall into your marriage, that can go, those expectations that you have of somebody can turn into hurt. And then you're not going to heal, like you're holding on to that. So you're not really healing from that. And then it turns into disappointment and maybe a fear of being hurt again. And then you create these insecurities about yourself and they turn into your own flaws. So like you even begin to hold judgment on yourself and hold these insecurities about yourself. And so it just can become a whole snowball effect, So, and I think it's easier for us to sometimes we judge because it feels safer than being vulnerable. So, like I said, we don't really like talk about some of those things. And so like you're not open to being vulnerable and just having a conversation. You just jump to being judgmental. And I think, sometimes it's easier to condemn somebody because it's easier than actually, like I said, communicating and just understanding maybe why somebody chose to do a certain something or just a certain circumstance, just it's easy for us to just jump the gun and not really understand the full situation, right? So I think that that also leads to unforgiveness, because whenever, you're holding on to that judgment. And so that becomes unforgiveness, and you sort of like that can fester. And, if you feel like maybe letting go of the situation, you're not in control. So, because letting go feels sometimes really uncertain. So, like, you're not in control of the situation. But I also think that, like, I wanna tie in, like, the unforgiveness part, and we have to remember that, like, forgiveness isn't approval, it's more of a release for yourself. So, forgiveness doesn't mean what they did was okay, or I'm letting them back in, or I'm pretending it didn't hurt. Forgiveness is you saying, I'm not carrying this anymore. It's not about the other person. It's about your heart and your peace and just setting yourself free. It's about that freedom. And, Jesus says, forgive and you will be forgiven. And not because God is keeping score, but because forgiveness keeps your heart soft. And whenever you keep your heart soft, you are going to be able to receive God's grace. I would also like to say that sometimes the harshest judgments that we make are really reflections of pain that we haven't dealt with. Sometimes that pain that you haven't dealt with from another situation sort of pours out onto a different person or a different situation. It really opens that door of, like, that pain that we haven't dealt with. So, I think that stems from, like, judgment can create distance, and, you can build those walls, and you can put people or situations in a certain little box and say, I'm just going to keep you over here. I don't have time to deal with that. You just put in its own little category, and then you begin to isolate yourself or that situation. But I think what you need to do is really that you need to have grace, because grace creates a connection. So instead of building those walls and creating that, like, isolation, like, you need to give grace, because it's going to build bridges and build connections and just open up those doors for communication and just making relationships and stronger ultimately. And really, when you give grace, you also have to think, maybe instead of like keeping that person or that situation in its own little category, you can be like, what? I've already been here. I understand their situation. Or, what? I've had a similar instance happen. And so you're creating grace. And whenever you have, like, you take a step back and you actually analyze the situation or just whatever it is going on, you begin to, your heart begins to soften, right? So that just invites that peace in, like, you're inviting that comforting sense of, I think you're inviting yourself to have a peace of mind. When we judge someone, we stop seeing them as a person and we start seeing them as a problem. And that's not okay. And I think we have to remember that, Jesus didn't rebuke the broken, the sinful, the messy, or the outcast. He rebuked the Pharisees, the religious elite, the self-righteous, the ones who thought they were better. And Jesus never shamed the sinner. He confronted the spirit of superiority. And I think we just have to remember that. You have to love people in the broken. You have to remember that, they may sin, but so do you. You have to remember that you're just as messy as they are. And I think whenever you do that, it's going to allow you to have that grace. It's going to allow you to really open yourself up and just realize that sometimes some of those things, they're just so silly. It's so silly to hold on to those little things. And really, judgment is often based on what we think we know. And like, we can judge people just by a moment, maybe a mistake that they made, a rumor, or just a season of life that they're in. You don't really know what's happening with them, and it's easy to jump to conclusions, right? So but then we have to remember that those things that you're seeing, that moment or that mistake that they made or that season that they're in that you're just not a part of and that you want to, be judgmental on, you have to take a step back and remember that that's not your place to judge or understand or know. That's God's, because God sees the whole story. He sees the potential. He sees the healing. He sees the bigger picture, the picture that we don't see, And with that, I think it's easy to say we judge people by the chapter that we walked in on, and God judges people by the whole book. And I know I keep talking on, like giving grace, but I really do feel like that is a big part of learning how to be judgment free, or at least how to better navigate that, right? I wouldn't say judgment free because you're never going to be judgment free, but judgment feels like you're in control of the situation. I said that earlier. You feel like you're in control, and it's easy to judge, and you like to feel like you're in control of the situation. You feel like you have the upper hand. But really, whenever you give that grace, you're opening yourself to trust. It feels like trust, judgment. Some examples I think I can give would be, judgment says like, I need to decide what you deserve. But grace is really saying, I trust God to handle what I can't. Or judgment is rooted in fear. Grace is rooted in faith. I think something that you can really reflect on, and maybe you can just say to yourself, is judgment is me trying to be God. Grace is me trusting God. And I think whenever you put that into perspective, us as Christians, and you hear that, it makes you want to take a step back, and it makes you want to be like, oh my goodness, it is not our place to judge. That is God's place to judge. And that's whenever you bring yourself in to giving grace, right? Because that's whenever you give grace, that's you putting your trust in God and letting Him handle the situation so you can bring yourself that joy and that peace. And then I also want to jump in and talk about, not only how to let go and how to bring in just giving that grace so you can give yourself peace, but also remembering that judgment blocks blessings. So going back to the scripture, it says, if you judge, you will be judged. If you condemn, you will be condemned. If you forgive, you'll be forgiven. It's not punishment. It's a spiritual principle. I think the measure you use is the measure that comes back to you. If you want grace, you have to give grace. And at the end of the day, judgment just hardens your heart. And when you open yourself up and you just begin to forgive, it softens you, because judgment is just going to make you cold and defensive and closed off and bitter. And you'll just begin to turn into a person that you don't know. But when you actually open yourself to forgive, it makes you more compassionate and open, and you just have a sense of peace, and you begin to have compassion. And I think that judgment it builds a prison around your heart. And whenever you open yourself up to forgiveness, that forgiveness is the key to letting go of that judgment. Now, I also want to talk about, judging yourself. I think that I do this to myself a lot, and I know there's probably so many of you out there that do. And, I think that we judge ourselves, and I think it's easy to extend grace to everyone else but yourself. So, if you are at a place within, in your journey where you are learning how to give grace and to not be so judgmental, but you still don't extend yourself enough grace, you just have to remember that, Jesus didn't exclude you from His command to forgive. So you also have to learn to forgive yourself. And once you do that, I think that is the ultimate remedy for happiness. I want to just take a moment to reflect on, like some of the things that I talked about, and I just want to pause and I just want you guys to ask yourself, have you been holding anyone in judgment? Like, who have you been holding in judgment? Who have you been silently condemning? Who have you been struggling to forgive? And maybe the hardest question, where have you been judging yourself? Because sometimes the voice that we need to silence isn't somebody else's. Sometimes it's our own. And I think that we just need to learn to take a breath. Just let God speak to us. Let him show you where he wants to bring freedom. And once we can do that, I think that you will begin to be set free. And with that, I just want to say thank you guys so much for joining me today on Faith by Fire. I know this episode was one of the shorter ones, but if you felt that this encouraged you or challenged you, share it with someone who might need a reminder of God's grace. And remember that letting go isn't a weakness, forgiveness isn't losing, and having grace isn't naive. These are the things that make you strong, and they give you that sense of freedom, and they bring you closer to God. And with that, I'm going to close, and until next time, this is Faith by Fire.